Guys, it's Becky from Champion Briefs here to do a topic analysis on the February public forum topic, Resolve the United States should adopt a carbon tax. Similar to the other videos that I've done for Champion Briefs, we're going to do an overview of the history. I really think that particularly with this topic, there's a lot of really important history that you have to be aware of, not so much understand in depth, but just like know that countries have tried to take action and really understand when the United States started this overall decision process for how they were going to respond to climate change and kind of what the current trajectory is. So bear with me while we go over the history. It is pretty important, and I'll highlight the really important stuff that you need to know. So starting in 1712, that's when you had like the Industrial Revolution. That was when the first steam engine was created. And in 1824 is when scientists started hypothesizing about the greenhouse effect. So basically that's like this concept that the ozone layer lets in a certain amount of heat from the sun's rays. That's enough to like warm the planet, but like not too much to like harm the planet. And so the greenhouse effect was like understanding that there are different gases that make up the ozone as well as the air that we breathe. So it's not just oxygen, basically. So that happened in 1824, 1866, right? We had the first automobile. And in the late 1800s was when some chemists in Sweden started hypothesizing that maybe pollutants or emissions from things like the cars and as well as like all of the coal burning plants that were created and used throughout the Industrial Revolution, like maybe we're having some type of implications on the overall greenhouse effect, like they were possibly changing them. But it wasn't until the 1950s, so fast forward 50, 60 years, it was the late 1950s, when scientists were like, I think CO2 emissions probably contribute to like changing global temperatures. So in the 50s, they started recording data, they started monitoring temperatures in places all over the world, and scientists really started to research whether or not emissions from like fossil fuels and coal, so all of these CO2 emissions were having some type of effect on the overall temperature and climates found around the world. It wasn't for another 20 years, so 1971, where the international community started discussing governmental obligations to deal with climate issues and like had a forum where they were like, climate change might be an issue, so we should probably look at this. In 1971, they had the UN Environmental Conference where the United Nations basically invited all of their countries together and were like, these are some environmental issues that might be problematic like in the next century or even in the next few decades, so we kind of feel like we should deal with these issues. There wasn't really any policy action that came out of it. It was more of like a forum to discuss things, but the 1970s was when the international community started like having conversations about environmental issues that existed across the globe. So fast forward to the end of the 1990s, in 1997, the Kyoto Protocol was created, which was basically like this conference that all of the United Nations countries were invited to, and it was the first time that the international community directly indicated pollutants in the air were affecting the temperatures or affecting the climate across the globe. So in 1997, all of the countries got together and were like, we need to do something about this. So their goal was between 2008 and 2012 to decrease CO2 emissions by 5%, or like air pollutants, not specifically CO2. So it doesn't sound like a lot, 5%, right? Like, it doesn't sound like a lot, but that is quite a bit. And as you start to read some goals that are suggested in policy actions, whether or not it's a carbon tax or cap and trade, right? All of these different things that governments can do, 5% is a lot. And most of the countries were like, yes, like this sounds like a good idea. We will sign on to this. And the United States was not, they were not having it. The United States Senate refused to ratify the Kyoto Protocol, which meant that they refused to say that the United States would follow it. And in 2001, President Bush formally removed the United States from the Kyoto Protocol process. So we were kicked out of the Kyoto Protocol club and didn't get involved in policy decisions and had nothing to do with it in 2001. 2005 is when the Kyoto Protocol started to become law. So countries that had ratified the treaty had to prove they had policy plans to reduce CO2 or air pollutant levels by 2012. So 2005 was really when the international community was we are going to address air pollutant levels, and the United States was we are not going to do it with you. It's very important to understand that the Kyoto Protocol really set the stage for how the United States views climate change, obligations to act. So the United States is not a big fan of acting multilaterally or with other countries when it comes to climate change, and would much rather act by itself, which was the message that we sent in 2001 when President Bush removed us from the Kyoto Protocol process. 2009, everything was great, and countries thought they'd figured out the effects of pollutant levels, and which countries were the biggest problems. In 2009, China surpassed the United States as the largest contributor of air pollutants, or the largest contributor of emissions that contributed to climate change. The United States is still the largest on a per capita basis, so on an individual per person basis. The United States has a bigger carbon footprint, but there was a really cool paper I read that talked about how the carbon footprint is determined. So goods that are produced in China and then shipped over to other nations, like the United States, for example, the consumer's carbon footprint is attributed to the country where the good is sold in and not the country that it originated in. So if China is producing a bunch of widgets at this firm in Shanghai, let's say, for example, or Beijing, right? Those carbon pollutant levels and the carbon footprint from creating all those widgets doesn't get assigned to China. It gets assigned to Canada, who buys all of these widgets from China. So that's why there's this discrepancy, and really why China is the biggest polluter overall, and why the United States is on a per capita basis. We import so much of our goods from China. So really, China is a huge issue that is kind of, I think, getting underplayed in some of the literature that's out there. In 2009, there was also another UN convention in Copenhagen, and it was basically called the Copenhagen Accord. Wasn't really any important policy decisions that came out of that. It was kind of just another UN conference to kind of address that climate change was happening and was a real thing and that we should deal with it. But nothing that came out of that is important for you to really understand and debate. So let's review the policy actions and the history that's happened, and then I'll kind of give you an idea of where we are now, right? So pollutant emissions started in the early 1700s, right, and were compounded in the mid-1800s when we introduced cars. Fast forward into the 1900s, the mid-1900s to the late 1900s, that's when we started kind of discovering and putting the pieces of the puzzle together that maybe these pollutant levels were having some type of effect on climate change or on global temperatures overall. And in the late 1990s, the international community kind of took a very firm path and were we are going to make some changes and ensure that the environment, right, isn't as polluted, and we kind of slow down climate change. And the United States was not willing to act with other nations and kind of just wanted to do their own thing. So that split happened in the 1990s. Kind of fast forward to now. So now scientists a lot of the articles that I was finding use this 95% statistic, and I think that was kind of their way of being a little bit sassy, but they were like 95% of scientists are like positive, like they like underlined positive, that CO2 emissions contribute to overall climate change. So the general consensus in the scientific community is that emissions, like greater emissions, equals more climate change. So like we have to deal with emissions. But the United States, as you have probably noticed from reading some news stories or kind of even just paying attention, not all of the policymakers are like sure that climate change does not actually have anything to do with CO2 levels. While the scientists, like the ones in charge of researching this, the ones whose like job is to understand like the scientific knowledge and like the scientific effects of like all of this stuff, like they are positive that climate change is a real thing. And the policymakers are like, well, I'm not a scientist, but I really don't know if that's happening. So I think it is 100% safe to assume that in the debate community, we follow literature and we are very persuaded by literature. So for all debate rounds, I really think that you should go into it with your research and your cases being like climate change is a real thing, right? Like if you say it's not a real thing, I think you might get some strange looks. But that's because I think the debate community is very in touch with current events and politics and kind of some of those debates that are happening in Washington or at individual state levels. So climate change is a real thing. Whether or not humans are contributing, right, I think that might be a little bit more negotiable for you in a debate round, but I would warn you, I really think that the tendency is to lean towards humans are contributing to climate change, right, and that is important to know as you go into the debate round. I do not think there are going to be any debates, maybe very, very few, if any, that are premised on whether or not humans contribute to overall climate change. So just keep that in mind as you head into the debate round. So I kind of want to talk about who are the big players now. We mentioned China, right? They're the biggest polluter overall, but the United States is the biggest on a per capita basis. Then you're followed by which I find interesting that they just like lump the European Union together as the third largest player when it comes to emission levels, which I think is very deceptive because emission levels are measured on an individual country basis. And so when you just like lump them together as like these 27 or 28 nations, right, I think that becomes difficult to like kind of decipher how much impact individual nations are having. India, Russia, and Japan are also big polluters, and so it's going to be kind of important to notice what those nations are doing to address climate change. I don't think that there will be any huge policy decisions made from any of the big players in the coming 6 weeks that we debate the public forum topic. I spent a lot of time kind of understanding what was happening now in the climate change debate, and I don't think that's going to be a thing. But just know that they are big players, so look empirically to what they've done. The three biggest causes, as you I'm sure know, are electricity, transportation, and industrial. So electricity, right, like there's a lot of reliance on coal and fossil fuels. Transportation, obviously fossil fuels, and industrial, like production, right? That's where you see big pollution levels in China, and that's where you see a lot of problems still in the United States. So let's talk a little bit about what the carbon tax is, right? So the carbon tax would basically be a flat tax that's levied on everything that produces CO2 emissions. So everything that has to do with burning coal or fossil fuels, anything that contributes to overall carbon dioxide emissions would be taxed. That tax, historically, that tax is levied on consumers, which means that the price of the goods that you would buy, if they were produced with electricity that relied on fossil fuel emissions, then the price of that good would increase. A really easy example is when you look at gas. So you go to the gas station to fill up your car, and if there was a carbon tax, there might be like a 4, 6, 16-cent tax on each gallon of gas that you buy. And that revenue would go back to the government, and as we'll discuss in a little bit, that's not quite sure where that would actually go in terms of like if the United States were to enact a carbon tax. So the countries that currently have a carbon tax, we have the British Columbia, Ireland, Chile, Sweden. There's a lot of EU nations that have it. South Africa, Zimbabwe. Pay careful attention. Australia had a carbon tax, but they repealed it in 2014 because it was so unpopular and like did so many negative things to their economy. So if you want to find a lot of stuff on the con side, like you will find a lot empirically about Australia. So just take note of that. There have been individual carbon taxes proposed at the state level in Colorado, California, Maryland, and there have been a lot of federal propositions. Bernie Sanders is supporting one. I think I counted 5 or 6 that had been proposed since 2001 at the federal level. Really hard to get support for that type of legislation, but there is like that push from state legislators and federal legislators. It's happening, it's just very quiet. The alternatives that exist, right, you have cap and trade, and the process for that is a little bit more complicated. So the government comes out with like this level of overall pollutants that's allowed to be emitted in a given year. So they cap the pollutant level. Then they give out these permits, or they sell these permits to companies or electrical companies or like coal plants or like coal mining industry like plants or like fossil fuel refineries. And those permits say that they can emit a certain level of pollutants in a given year. And then like all those permits that the United States government issues like adds up to the overall cap level. Under cap and trade, right, you can like trade around a lot of the permits, and there's a lot of suggestions that being able to trade and basically if you play the game right, you won't have to use or like abide by any of the permits, so you could like emit as much as you wanted if you were like a factory. So there's a lot that talks about how it's really bad and allows for gaming the markets. So kind of keep that in mind. That's really the only alternative that's been proposed to a carbon tax. The United States has a cap and trade system in place right now. There's a lot of debate about whether or not it's effective or not, and I'll let you kind of determine that. The last thing I want to highlight before I tell you about the Paris climate talks is the word should in the resolution, and I know that there will be a lot of focus on that if you read any of the topic analyses in the Champion Briefs debate briefs, but I think you need to pay specific attention to should when you're writing your cases. So some things that I was like thinking of as I was helping my team prep and kind of helping research was like, should you do something? Well, does that like, is it effective, right? Is there a moral obligation? Who's responsible? What's the best way? And there are like all of these questions that have to deal with whether or not the United States should do something. Like, should we enact a carbon tax if it's not going to be very effective, right? And I think that's what allows you to center the debate around scientific evidence to be like, yes, climate change is real. Yes, humans contribute to it. But like, is this really the best policy action? And I think that is a very good way and a very constructive way to approach the debate. And I'm worried that if you say that climate change isn't real, that there might be like bigger problems in the round. And I don't know if the judge will buy you as very credible. Just a suggestion. So last thing I'm going to talk about as we wrap this up is the Paris climate talks and kind of what's happening there. So the Paris climate talks happened a couple months ago. President Obama went, and they want to, the consensus they came to at the end was decrease or like hold climate change temperature changes to 1.5 degrees Celsius in the next 30 years. And so in order to do that, though, the United States and like other countries would have to have like a 0 carbon footprint by 2030 to like slow climate change down to 2 degrees Celsius or 1.5 a year. So just be aware on the international level, like there are some things happening. There's a big push on developing nations who are still relying on fossil fuel and coal usage, and the United States was more gung-ho and more supportive about a multilateral effort in the Paris climate talks than they were in the Kyoto Protocol. So good luck in the debates. Make sure you understand the United States' historic responses to climate change, what's happening now, what's happened at the state level, and make sure you frame your cases around the should argument. I think there is a lot of stuff to be explored there. So good luck if you have national qualifiers this month. I hope you all succeed, and I will see you all at nationals.